Welcome everyone to the Department of Justice Community-Oriented Policing Services webinar on CTAS Purpose Area 1. My name is Christina and I will be your moderator for today. It is my pleasure to turn things over to our subject matter experts from the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. Your presenter today will be Melissa Harrington. Go ahead, Melissa.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your interest in the COPS Purpose Area 1 application webinar. COPS Purpose Area 1 provides funding for two activities, the hiring of officers and/or equipment and training. What's new for 2019 for Purpose Area number 1? The solicitation has been updated to be more user-friendly. We have reduced the page limit requirements for both the Tribal Community and Justice Profile as well as your Purpose Area 1 narrative. We also ask that you input your timeline into the narrative itself so you don't have to do a separate timeline document. We also eliminated an optional document, which is the application overview. We also updated and tried to make it more user-friendly the budget detail worksheet as well as the demographic form. Two new items specifically for Purpose Area number 1 is that we are allowing a full-time anti-opioid coordinator, salaries and benefits, as another civilian position. The other civilian position one could apply for is the anti-meth coordinator. And also this year, we have adjusted the funding caps, and we'll talk more about it throughout the presentation. But just as a heads up, based on the competitiveness and the funding available for 2019, this year we will provide funding for a sworn force of fewer than 10, you're eligible for up to $300,000. Sworn force of 10 to fewer than 20, no more than $500,000. Sworn force of 20 and more, no more than $800,000. On the demographics form, we're asking you to input your SAM registration date as well as provide us your current government executive's information. In the event that you are awarded, we can reach out to him or her. Also on the budget detail worksheet, we also are asking you to input your name as well as a budget point of contact name, contact, phone number, email. So in the event that you are in the queue for an award, our office can contact the person who's most familiar with the actual budget request of your application. We are still asking for a tribal resolution. There's no prescribed form of documentation. Any type of letter will suffice to satisfy the tribal resolution. And in the event that you cannot submit your application electronically, please contact our response center no later than January 25th to obtain an alternative way to submit your application. Overall, the COPS Purpose Area 1 provides the following goals: to proactively address the most serious law enforcement needs, to enhance community policing strategies, and to engage in strategic planning. We would like to increase the capacity of tribal law enforcement agencies for safer communities, enhance your ability to prevent, solve, and control crime, engage in anti-meth and in anti-opioid activities, and address human trafficking. Overall, applicants can request funding for hiring, training, and equipment to advance community policing and to help address community issues. Who's eligible under Purpose Area number 1? Applicants are limited to federally recognized Indian tribal governments as determined by the Secretary of the Interior. This also includes Alaska Native villages and tribal consortia, consisting of 2 or more federally recognized tribes. Applicants must have an established law enforcement agency that is operational as of February 26th, which is the closing date of this application, or receive services through a new or existing contract for law enforcement services with the BIA or a state and local agency. We opened this application on November 27th, and it closes on February 26th, 2019 at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We anticipate hopefully $20 million to give out at hopefully 50 awards. Traditionally, our awards are for 3 years or 36 months. Again, the funding caps are for 2019. The awards will be capped based on your sworn force level, and the awards will be capped again, a sworn force of fewer than 10, no more than 300,000, a sworn force of 10 to fewer than 20, no more than 500,000, and a sworn force of 20 or more, no more than 800,000. Under the hiring activity, tribes may request funding for salaries and benefits for officers. We define a career law enforcement officer to be an officer hired on a permanent basis who's authorized by law or by state or local public agency to engage in or supervise the prevention, detection, or investigation of criminal law violations. Background investigations for these newly hired officers is an eligible request. Additionally, under the hiring activity, one could apply for 2 civilian positions if interested, and those positions are for civilian salaries and benefits for a full-time anti-meth and/or anti-opioid coordinator. Those are the only 2 civilian positions one could apply for. Please refer to our 2019 allowable and unallowable cost list that's listed on our homepage as well as our tribal justice site. Everything that you would need to apply will be on both pages. That includes our solicitation as well as a resource guide and also this allowable and unallowable cost list to help you prepare your application. Under the equipment activity, one could apply for some of these items that are listed. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. Please refer to our list on our homepage. But if you're interested in applying in the equipment application, items such as under the equipment, you could apply for law enforcement equipment, uniforms, bulletproof vests, basic issue equipment. Under technology, you could apply for computers, hardware, software, training, law enforcement training, such as basic, comprehensive, or specialized police training. Again, anti-opioid or human trafficking training. Under travel, items such as airfare, lodging, and mileage reimbursement. For Purpose Area 1, you are required to budget at least 2 representatives to attend the required grantee orientation, and we ask that you budget for costs for Washington, D.C., and use the GSA to determine those estimates. Also, another item that you can apply for is anti-meth and/or anti-opioid activities. Another activity that's eligible this year is overtime costs for sworn officers engaged in community policing. The overtime requests, though, are limited as follows. You are eligible to request overtime, but it is based on your sworn force. Sworn force of fewer than 10, no more than 25,000 can be requested in overtime costs. A sworn force of 10 to fewer than 20, no more than 50,000 in overtime costs. And a sworn force of 20 or more, no more than 75,000 in overtime costs. But again, please refer to the 2019 allowable, unallowable cost list, where it itemized specifically what items we are allowing and not allowing. This is just some helpful tips as we move over to the financial piece of our presentation. And that is, we do have an Excel budget worksheet template that we are strongly recommending that you use. You don't see it online except when you go into GMS, so we don't have the sample readily available as we have the samples for the narrative or the profile templates. But we do recommend that you go into GMS and see the budget Excel worksheet. If for some reason you cannot enable the macros or have issues with it, however you need to prepare your budget, you can do so, but just make sure you have everything in it. And you'll see the budget worksheet. We'll go through it. If you are applying for indirect costs, please make sure that you state what the indirect cost is being applied to and provide that IDC agreement information. And break out the fringe benefits. This is just a reminder that for agencies that do not include fringe benefits as part of their base salary costs and typically calculate these separately, The allowable fringe benefits may be included in Section B of the Budget Detail Worksheet. Any fringe benefits that are already included as part of your base salary within Section A of the Budget Detail Worksheet should not be listed as a duplicative request. So now we're going to move on to the financial piece of our presentation for Purpose Area 1. You'll see on the screen some links, again, for further information, our solicitation, our allowable, unallowable cost list. There's also a DOJ grants financial guide, as well as some IDCs, FAQs if interested. There are 9 categories under Purpose Area 1 or on our budget worksheet. There's only 8 that technically you can apply for and that you're eligible. One of the categories is construction, and this is a non-construction program. The budget detail worksheet should provide the detailed computation for each budget line item, listing the total cost of each line item and showing how it was calculated by the applicant. So for example, cost for personnel should show the current negotiated annual salary for an entry-level officer with reasonable anticipated increases in year 2 and 3. Please also list the appropriate yearly totals for each allowable fringe benefit that will be paid by the agency for the salary. There should be a clear link between the activities proposed and the items included in the budget. And again, please make sure that if you do use a different format other than the budget detail worksheet, that you include everything that we need. The budget narratives for Purpose Area number 1. Within the budget worksheet, you will list the costs, the quantities, and also provide a budget narrative. The budget narrative should thoroughly and clearly describe every category of expense listed in the budget detail worksheet. The narrative should also explain how all costs were estimated and how they're relevant to the completion of the proposed project. Applicants should demonstrate in their budget narratives how they will maximize cost effectiveness of grant expenditures. So for example, in the personnel hiring activity, you will enter personnel. You will select either sworn officer or civilian position. You will enter the current negotiated annual salary, compensation paid for employees engaged in grant activities, and in the budget narrative, you will include the description of the responsibilities and duties of each position. Here is an example of a screenshot of what you will see. We recommend that you list the current entry-level base salary and fringe benefits rounded to the nearest whole dollar for one full-time sworn officer position within your agency. Again, here's a screenshot of the budget worksheet. You will select the button to choose either a sworn officer or a civilian position. Again, it can only be a meth or an opioid coordinator. You enter the number of the positions, and then you enter the negotiated annual salary. The fringe benefits, as a reminder, should be based on actual known costs or an approved negotiated rate by a federal agency. If not, based on an approved negotiated rate, list the composition of the fringe benefit package by individual line items. Fringe benefits are for the personnel listed in the budget category and should be reflective of the benefits that all other employees of the agency receive. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and the budget narrative. Here is an example of the fringe benefits. There are 9 fringe benefits listed by name, as you see here on the screen. Again, you will record the amount for each line item that your agency contributes in addition to the salary. You enter the appropriate total for each line item for each year's based on the year's salary. Please make a special note. At the top, the question asks, does salary include sick leave or does salary include vacation time? If you answer yes to those questions, then in the bottom, you should not have it listed twice. So if you offer your employees the ability to accrue vacation and sick leave in the base salary, you should not list this as a separate total in these line items. So again, you must answer the 2 questions at the top of the fringe benefits chart. Yes means that you allow vacation and sick time, so you do not need to add it separately in the lines below. Moving on to the next activity that you could apply for would be travel. Under travel, you will describe the purpose of each travel request in reference to the project objectives. Airfare, lodging, and mileage reimbursement for meetings related to purpose area activities, including costs associated with the required DOJ orientation, would be included in your travel section. Here is a screenshot of what a travel item looks like. As you can see, there's two areas. There's an item narrative under travel to the right, and then there's a travel narrative section. So there's two boxes. Whatever you're asking for example, if you're asking for travel, in the item narrative section, we would like you to say that you will enter in the item narrative box CTAS required orientation training. 2 people for 3 days at X airfare, X lodging, and M&IE costs. That is what we would like in the item narrative box, a short and sweet description of what you're asking for. But in the bigger box, the travel narrative, you will explain what, where, and how much for each item. You're also going to explain how, in this box, how they relate to the goals and objective of this award. Again, a detailed breakdown of the costs and how they were calculated. So, for example, I looked up the GSA website and I realized that it's going to cost me $2,000 to send 2 people to Washington, D.C. to attend the grantee orientation. So just make a special note, the item narrative versus the travel narrative boxes, and the more information you provide, the better for us as we're reviewing your applications. Under equipment, again, it's not an exhaustive list that we have shown here, but again, refer to our allowable, unallowable cost list, but one could apply for law enforcement equipment in the equipment category. In this category, you would request bulletproof vests or basic issue equipment such as police cars, technology. Again, in your narrative, you will explain how the equipment is necessary for the success of your project. Also describe the procurement method to be used in the budget narrative field. Here is a screenshot again of the equipment activity. You click on the appropriate button to add the equipment or delete a request. You enter the equipment costs accordingly. The federal threshold for non-expendable items is defining as having a useful life of more than 1 year with a fair market value of $5,000 or more. Provide greater details about the items that you've requested in the narrative section at the end of each category. Under the supplies, we consider that any items, expendable items, costing less than $5,000 should be included in the supplies. You would list items such as clothing, uniform accessories, binoculars, books, handheld tape recorders, etc. Again, all requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and budget narrative. Here is a screenshot of what the supplies looks like. In the supplies section, you want to include any expendable item that costs less than $5,000. The next category is the construction, and that does not apply to us, so you can skip that. There's another section of the budget worksheet that's called contracts. Please refer to the DOJ financial guide for further guidance on procurement contracts, sole source justifications, and consultants. On our homepage, we also have our fact sheets on sole source justification as well as consultants. For the procurement contracts, you would like to provide a description of the project or service to be procured by contract and an estimate of the cost. For subawards, provide a description of the federal award activities proposed to be carried out by any subrecipient and an estimate of the cost. Include the cost per subrecipient to the extent known prior to the application submission. Here is a screenshot for contracts and subawards. Be aware of the justification requirements for sole source over $250,000. And for consultant fees, DOJ grant-making component's maximum rate for an 8-hour day is currently $650, and it will require additional justification and prior approval from the respective DOJ grant-making component. So for consultant fees, for each consultant, enter your name, if known, service to be provided, hourly or daily fee, and estimated time. And then again, consultant fees in excess of the DOJ grant-making maximum rate more than $650 would require additional justification. And here's a screen of the consultant costs, and the recipient must provide justification for any consultant rate in excess of $650 per day, and you must receive COPS approval of that rate before drawing down funds. In the other cost category, that's where you would include items such as overtime costs for officers engaged in community policing and or background investigations for the newly officers hired. List any items that cannot be classified as equipment or supplies. Again, all requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and budget narrative. Here's a screenshot of the other cost section. Again, you want to include items not defined as equipment, which is items over $5,000, or supplies, expendable items less than $5,000. You click on the appropriate button to add an item or delete a request. You enter the costs accordingly, and you provide greater details in the item narrative and the other cost narrative section. For overtime, again, it will be listed as a single line item entry in the other cost category, labeled overtime, for the entire eligible amount of overtime that you are requesting. This amount includes your hourly overtime rate as well as the corresponding eligible fringe benefits. Just a reminder, the cap for overtime is as follows. Sworn force of fewer than 10, no more than 25,000. Sworn force of 10 to fewer than 20, no more than 50,000. Sworn force of 20 and more, no more than 75,000. Review the chart for overtime costs, and please keep in mind the potential effect of overtime on indirect costs, as that may limit your potential buying power. Regarding indirect costs are allowed only if an applicant has a current federally approved indirect cost rate, or the applicant is eligible to use and elects to use the de minimis indirect cost rate, as described in 2 CFR. An applicant with a current federally approved indirect cost rate must attach a copy of the rate approval at the time of application. If the applicant does not have an approved rate, one can be requested by contacting the applicant's cognizant federal agency, which will review all documentation and approve a rate for the applicant's organization. Or if the applicant's accounting system permits, costs may be allocated in the direct cost category. Narrative for any indirect costs should clearly state which direct cost the indirect cost rate is being applied to. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and budget narrative. In order to use the de minimis indirect rate, an applicant would need to attach written documentation to the application that advises DOJ of both the applicant's eligibility to use the de minimis rate and its election. If the applicant elects the de minimis method, costs must be consistently charged as either indirect or direct costs, but may not be double charged or inconsistently charged as both. In addition, if this method is chosen, then it must be used consistently for all federal awards until such time as the applicant entity chooses to negotiate a federally approved indirect cost rate. Here's a screenshot of the indirect cost. Budget worksheet, section I, you would enter the rate as listed on the approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement. You enter the amount that will be used as the base. You identify the direct costs in the budget that will be excluded from the base as required by the IDC agreement. Use the narrative section to adequately describe the items that make up the base. Identify the direct costs in the budget that will be excluded from the base as required by the IDC agreement. And what happens if you do not have a current approved indirect cost rate at time of application? No worries. Submit what you have, even if it is an expired rate. And if awarded, our office will freeze your indirect costs until you can provide us a current IDC rate. Indirect costs are generally allowed only if the applicant has a current approved rate. attach a copy of that approved rate. An award recipient without an approved rate will be unable to recover funds until a rate is approved. The recipient will need to provide the awarding officer with an updated agreement in order to begin recovering funds for indirect costs. So if awarded and you have just an expired IDC rate, we will freeze the IDC funds until such time that you can produce the updated rate. And during our negotiations with you, you can also submit any type of documentation that justifies or explains that you are in negotiation with the Interior Business Center to get you an updated IDC. I'm presenting, and I'm Melissa Harrington, as well as Ann Beeman are our COPS Purpose Area 1 points of contact. If you have any programmatic types of questions, we are here to help, as well as our response center, which is 1-800-421-6770. They're here Monday through Friday. You can also email the response center by emailing at tribalgrants@usdoj.gov. Just a reminder that the application closes February 26, 2019. Thank you very much for your interest in 2019. And at this time, we can open the floor to questions.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. The first question is, for the tribes that apply and have tribal law enforcement, rather than law enforcement, can they contract with a local law enforcement agency to have a sheriff on staff? The sheriff's salary would be above entry-level salary, and they understand they would need to offset the remaining costs. Would you recommend instead applying for equipment? How many tribes applied for equipment last year, and how many were funded?
The part about equipment, if you want officers, then you should apply for officers. If you want equipment, you should apply for equipment. In terms of equipment awards, if you go to our homepage, we have a listing of 2018 awards that lists hiring and/or equipment, I believe. And my colleague just wanted me to share that 126 tribes applied in 2018 and 48 tribes were awarded. In terms of hiring, and just for everyone's disclosure, I'm in an office here with fellow subject matter experts that could also answer questions. Hiring of an officer, salaries and benefits is what you are eligible to apply for. Applying for an officer that will also have sheriff duties is fine. Ultimately, it is based on your estimate of how much it will cost this officer the salaries and benefits for a 3-year period. There is a retention requirement for our officers. Your job is to estimate what the annual salaries and benefits are for entry-level sworn law enforcement officers who may also have these sheriff capabilities.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Another question is, Washington State has recently mandated training in de-escalation and mental health. Can we apply CTAS Purpose Area 1 funding towards such training?
Sure. Even though some items may not specifically be listed on our allowable, unallowable list, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not allowed. Absolutely. It doesn't hurt to ask. And de-escalation training sounds like an eligible training activity.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Another question is, we do not have sworn law enforcement officers. We have several hundred staff in our public safety department. Your agency in the past has considered them to be private security. However, we have a contract with county sheriff to detain individuals suspected of committing crimes, which is transferred over to the responding sheriff's officer for arrest and release determination. Can we apply for PA1, and if so, what is our award threshold?
So we define primary law enforcement authority to be an agency with primary law enforcement authority that is the first responder to calls for service and has ultimate and final responsibility for the prevention, detection, or investigation of violations of criminal laws within its jurisdiction. Primary authority includes answering calls for service as a first responder, which differentiates from agencies that only do criminal investigation type of work. And on the demographics form, you will enter your sworn force levels, and that will dictate the funding cap.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Another question is, the solicitation says meth or opiate full-time position. Can you combine into one position to work on both issues?
Sure, and there's no retention requirement for civilian positions.
Great, thank you. And regarding overtime, if officers have different pay rates, must the narrative include a breakout for each officer in advance?
Maybe an estimate. Ultimately, you're capped at $25,000, $50,000, or $75,000 based on your sworn force level. But absolutely, if they want to provide the overtime based on an estimate with averages is recommended, and you can just explain that in the narrative, the overtime narrative and the overtime narrative line item. But yes, they can do that. Ultimately, you're capped, but however you need to do it to spread the wealth.
Great, thank you. Another question is, our tribe has a contract with a travel service that handles all of our flight and hotel requests. We have to use that entity by tribal policy. Their pricing is generally higher than GSA pricing. We don't have a GSA agreement and have been told that we don't have to follow the same as the federal agencies.
Sure. So you can follow your own procurement practices. If you have a travel agency or entity that is providing you travel estimates, you're absolutely eligible to apply based on what your travel liaison told you. Ultimately, though, as good stewards of federal funding, our office will review your budget and determine if it is efficient, equitable, and fair. And ultimately, if there are reductions, you will be notified. But generally, if this was your money, how would you spend it? And you want to just try to be a good steward of that and get more than one estimate, I think, on anything. But you're more than welcome to use your travel liaison to estimate the costs. And ultimately, if awarded, our office will review it based on allocability. But primarily for travel purposes, we generally do not exceed the GSA guidelines, just as a FYI.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Another question is, if we currently have a PA3 CTAS grant, can we make a new application for a small amount, $50,000 to $60,000?
They have an existing, or they're applying for Purpose Area 3?
It says they currently have a PA3, must have been awarded in this past cycle.
Okay, sure. For our purposes, for COPS Purpose Area 1, everyone is eligible to apply for 2019. If you have a previous award, that's fine. So for Purpose Area 3, that's BJA, I'm not sure what that person was awarded, but clearly our offices don't fund the same items. But we will definitely make sure that there's no duplication of effort. But absolutely, if there's existing awardees in other purpose areas, or if there are existing COPS awardees, there's no restrictions for anyone could apply again for our purpose. Area 1.
Great, thank you. And another question is, we have tribal conservation wardens. Are we allowed to apply for startup equipment for our tribal conservation wardens?
Yes, we have an FAQ on that. Let me read it off because I think the answer sounds better than what I just said. So my tribal government has multiple components of law enforcement departments, such as Fish and Wildlife, that we're including. Do we need to report full and part-time budgeted sworn force? You should report all cumulative full and part-time budgeted sworn force strength numbers for all law enforcement departments in your tribe that would receive funding through this request if awarded. The total number of sworn in your tribe includes all sworn officers, so that would include the Fish and Game, Natural Resources, Police Department, etc. So the answer to that question is yes. Providing equipment for their conservation officers is eligible.
Great, thank you. What is the retention requirement for a contracted sheriff? And this was relating to the question previously asked about contracting with a local sheriff. And then there's a follow-up to clarify, would the entry-level cost be based upon what we pay to our entry-level tribal law enforcement officers?
Yes. And whether it's a sheriff or an officer, it's the position that needs to be retained. And the retention requirement is after 3 years of federal funding, you are expected to maintain the position for at least 1 year with local funds. It's the position that needs to be maintained.
And to clarify, would the entry-level cost be based upon what they pay to the entry-level tribal law enforcement officers?
Yes.
For budgeting amounts, is the $300,000 for each year, or is it for the entire 3-year period?
It's for the entire 3-year period.
Great, thank you.
And there is no local match, just as a heads up.
Great, thank you. And there has been a request to please repeat the requirement for retaining officers beyond the life of the grant.
Sure. After 3 years of federal funding, it is expected that you maintain the positions awarded for at least 1 year with local funding.
Great, thank you. Can you please give examples of civilian positions that may be eligible?
Yes, there's only 2 civilian positions that are eligible, which is an anti-meth or an anti-opioid coordinator. And they have to be full-time, the officers as well, but full-time officers and or full-time civilian positions. And the only 2 civilian positions that we will allow are an anti-meth and or anti-opioid coordinator.
Great, thank you. And there's a question to confirm the working definition for law enforcement for Purpose Area 1. They indicate is to identify, apprehend, and prosecute individuals who will illegally transport, distribute, and abuse illegal substances in tribal communities, subject to existing legal authority. Support programming to improve officer safety and improve the delivery of law enforcement services related to crime and the opioid epidemic and other addictions in the tribal community. So the tribal enforcement department that cannot prosecute crimes committed on a reservation would not qualify for Purpose Area 1. Can you please clarify?
Just to reiterate, a law enforcement agency is established and operational if the jurisdiction has passed authorizing legislation and has a current operating budget. We consider a law enforcement agency to be an agency with primary law enforcement authority that is the first responder to calls for service, that has the ultimate and final responsibility for the prevention, detection, or investigation of violations of criminal laws. Primary authority includes answering calls for service as a first responder.
Great, thank you. And another question is, can you repeat the ratio of the 2018 COPS applicants and the number of awardees?
Sure. We received 126 applications, but ultimately 48 tribes were awarded. But don't be discouraged about that. We strongly recommend that you take a look at our solicitation. It is competitive, unfortunately, because of the limited amount of money. There is no local match. It's 3 years worth of federal funding. Take a look, do a needs assessment, see what you might need in terms of hiring or equipment needs for your first responders. We will continue, the funding caps are there for us to try to award as many as we can. Please apply. Do not let the stats scare you.
Do we need a resolution for the CTAS grants, or is a letter of authority sufficient?
Yes, a letter of authority is sufficient, and it's one for all of the purpose areas, so please just have it. And for our purposes, we will contact you if it's missing. But any prescribed form of documentation, and we list in our solicitation general information as to what one needs. But generally, it's any type of documentation authorizing the applicant to apply, and always signed by the official, and it's usually dated for the current year. It's active and current. And if it's missing, it's not going to knock you out. We will contact you for it. and just one is needed for all of the purpose areas that you can apply for. And you are eligible to apply for as many purpose areas as you want. It doesn't have to be just purpose area 1. And just a reminder, you submit your application electronically through GMS, and if you get stuck submitting applications in GMS, please remember that there is a GMS support hotline to call, and that number is 1-888-549-9901, option 3. And they're available Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to midnight Eastern Standard Time. So if you're having issues with the micro Excel worksheet or GMS system itself, please contact them. But if you have questions about eligibility or program type of questions, that's what the response center is for, and they can be reached at 1-800-421-6770, or you can email us at tribalgrants@usdoj.gov.
Great, thank you. They wanted to seek confirmation if prosecution is under adjudication in a criminal justice system, does that differ from law enforcement?
My colleagues and I say that it does. It is different.
Thank you. And the guidance with regards to the timeline is a little vague. Could you please clarify exactly what is expected with regards to the submission of a timeline?
Sure. So last year, the timeline was a separate document, but this year, you're going to answer the timeline, how long this proposal will be, by answering the question that we have in our narrative. I believe all of the purpose areas have a timeline question, but for us specifically, you will answer the timeline, how long, the milestones that you're proposing. It's actually one of the questions in our Purpose Area 1 narrative. So you will answer the timeline within our Purpose Area 1 narrative document.
Great, thank you. How much funding is my tribe eligible to receive under Purpose Area 1?
Tribes with a sworn force of less than 10 are eligible for up to $300,000 in COPS office awards. Tribes with a sworn force of 10 to less than 20 are eligible for up to $500,000. Tribes with a sworn force of 20 or more are eligible for up to $800,000. And our office will determine that based on the staffing numbers that you enter on the demographic form. The actual number of sworn officer positions is the actual number of sworn positions full-time and part-time employed by your tribe as the date of this application. And the total number of sworn law enforcement officers in your tribe includes all sworn officers in all law enforcement agencies that your tribe may have, such as police, fish and game, and natural resources, etc.
Great, thank you. And a follow-up question to the timeline. Were you referring to question 4 for the timeline?
Let me take a look at the narrative myself. And to answer your question, yes, it is. The timeline will be answered in number 4 of the Purpose Area number 1 narrative. That is correct. Thank you. We thought it would be less of a burden to have applicants not submit so much.
Great, thank you. And is there a local match requirement?
No, there is not a local match requirement under Purpose Area 1.
And what is the length of the grant award?
Our grants are for 36 months or for 3 years. Awardees do have an option to ask for an extension, which is not for more money, but for more time. But in general, our grants are for 3 years. And that is for both hiring and or equipment and training awards.
And another question is, where can I get the resource guide?
Sure. So on our tribal justice site, as well as our COPS website, the resource guide is just supplemental information that used to be in the solicitation, but it's just separate now. But it's very user-friendly. So everything is on our tribal justice site and our COPS homepage. Justice.gov/tribal is the main tribal justice website that has the solicitation document, the resource guide document, samples of a narrative template, the profile template, fact sheets, for each of the purpose areas. And for purpose area 1 in particular, you have the allowable, unallowable cost list. The deadline is February 26th. Take your time, but please don't wait until the last minute. The applications are submitted through an electronic system, so sometimes if you wait until the last minute, things could get a little stressful, things could break down, so it's recommended that you try your best to try to get it in as soon as you can. You have opportunities to continue to update it up until February 26th, but the last time you submit, that would be the record that will go in as your application. But take your time, but again, please don't wait, especially on the final day. The system, it could be slow, and it could just add some extra stress for you. So please try to prepare. It's recommending you register in GMS early. Just try your best to start preparing sooner rather than later.
Great, thank you. Do any of our presenters or panelists have any additional comments to share?
We just want to say thank you again for your interest. We hope that you can apply. Again, please feel free to review the solicitation. There's also a resource guide as well. Both of those documents are helpful. Please don't hesitate to contact us, Ann or myself. Please don't hesitate to contact the Response Center. It answers our questions, but also can answer the other purpose area questions as well. A reminder that our allowable, unallowable cost list is available. And again, thank you for your interest.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you again for joining, and have a great day.
Thank you.